The morning sun had barely peeked over the Atlanta skyline when Dr. Michelle Thompson's phone buzzed with an urgent message. A critical patient in Boston needed her expertise, a complex brain surgery that couldn't wait. As one of the country's leading neurosurgeons, she was used to these emergency calls, but today it would be different. Not because of the medical challenge ahead, but because of what awaited her at the airport. She quickly packed her essential medical documents in a small overnight bag, her mind already running through the surgical procedure she'd need to perform. Her husband gave her a quick kiss goodbye, used to these sudden departures after 12 years of marriage. "Go save another life," he said with a proud smile, handing her the travel mug of coffee he'd already prepared. The drive to the private aviation terminal was smooth, with early morning traffic still light. Dr. Thompson had used Elite Airways countless times before. Their reliability and convenience had made them her go-to choice for emergency medical travels. She pulled up to the terminal in her Tesla, the same way she had dozens of times before. The familiar face of Ray, the usual morning security guard, wasn't at his post today. Instead, a new guard squinted at her credentials with unusual scrutiny. Inside the terminal, something felt off. The usual warm greetings from the ground staff were replaced with cold stares and whispered conversations. Dr. Thompson checked her reflection in her phone. Her pressed silk blouse, tailored pants, and pearl earrings were as professional as always. She'd learned early in her career to always dress impeccably, a habit that had served her well through countless hospital boards and medical conferences. At the check-in counter, the attendant's fingers moved sluggishly across the keyboard. "I'm sorry, but I'm seeing some issues with your reservation," she said, not meeting Dr. Thompson's eyes. Dr. Thompson pulled up the confirmation email on her phone, the same type she'd received and used numerous times before. "Everything's in order," she said calmly, showing the screen. "My patient's surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Time is crucial." The attendant made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones. More staff began to gather nearby, stealing glances in her direction. Dr. Thompson felt her heart rate quicken, but kept her professional composure, the same steadiness that had served her through countless high-pressure surgeries. She'd been in similar situations before, but something about this felt different, more deliberate. A young tech executive waiting for his own flight noticed the commotion. He'd been tapping away on his laptop, but now watched the scene unfold with growing concern. The staff's behavior seemed oddly coordinated, like a poorly rehearsed play where everyone knew their discriminatory parts, but tried to mask them with paper-thin excuses about procedures and protocols. Minutes ticked by, precious time that Dr. Thompson knew her patient couldn't afford to lose. She pulled out her phone and called her medical assistant in Boston, asking her to update the patient's family about a potential delay. Even in this moment of personal distress, her first thought was for her patient's well-being. The terminal's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. Other passengers began to take notice, some pretending not to see, others watching with obvious discomfort. Dr. Thompson stood there, her hospital ID badge clearly visible, her credentials unquestionable, yet somehow being treated as if she didn't belong in this exclusive space she'd navigated professionally for years. Little did anyone know that this ordinary morning would soon spark a national conversation about privilege, prejudice, and power in private aviation. The events about to unfold would not only change Dr. Thompson's life, but would force an entire industry to confront its deeply rooted biases. The private aviation terminal's automatic doors whooshed open as Dr. Thompson finally made her way past the unusually lengthy check-in process. The familiar scent of leather seats and fresh coffee that usually welcomed her was there, but something else hung in the air, an invisible tension that made her shoulders tighten. She'd just gotten off the phone with Boston General Hospital. Her patient's family was anxious, and rightfully so. Every minute counted when it came to brain surgery, and she was already running behind schedule. She gripped her medical bag a little tighter, feeling the weight of her responsibilities. A young flight attendant approached, then stopped short, looking uncertain. She glanced back at her colleagues before continuing forward. "Dr. Thompson," she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "We need to verify some additional information." It was the third time she'd been asked to show her credentials in the past 30 minutes. The terminal wasn't busy, just a handful of other passengers waiting for their flights. A businessman in a charcoal suit looked up from his newspaper, his brow furrowed. A couple returning from what looked like a golf trip whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Dr. Thompson and the increasingly clustered airline staff. "Is there a problem?" Dr. Thompson asked, her voice calm but firm. She'd perfected this tone over years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room. The flight attendant shifted her weight from one foot to another, avoiding direct eye contact. "Just following protocol, ma'am," she replied, though her voice suggested otherwise. Behind the counter, two ground staff members were having an animated discussion in hushed tones. One kept gesturing at a computer screen while shaking her head. Dr. Thompson had flown this airline enough times to know this wasn't normal protocol. She'd been a preferred member of their medical transport program for 5 years, often called upon for emergency surgeries across the country. A tall man in a pilot's uniform emerged from a side door, speaking in low tones with what appeared to be the lead flight attendant. They both kept glancing in Dr. Thompson's direction. The pilot's face was set in a stern expression as he nodded along to whatever the flight attendant was saying. The tech executive from earlier had moved closer, pretending to be absorbed in his phone. But Dr. Thompson noticed he angled his device slightly upward, its camera likely capturing the unfolding scene. She felt a mix of gratitude and sadness, grateful that someone was documenting this, sad that it was necessary. Time continued to tick by. Dr. Thompson checked her watch again. Her patient's family would be getting another update soon, and she still hadn't boarded. She pulled out her phone to show her medical credentials again, along with the hospital's emergency transport authorization. The documents were met with more uncertain glances and unclear responses. Other staff members began to gather near the boarding gate, creating a small crowd that seemed to be waiting for something or someone. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. Even the usual sounds of the terminal, the gentle hum of air conditioning, the distant roar of engines, seemed muted under the weight of the moment. Through the terminal's large windows, Dr. Thompson could see her scheduled aircraft sitting on the tarmac. Its engines were still quiet, its stairs still down, waiting. But the growing knot in her stomach told her this delay wasn't about mechanical issues or weather conditions. This was something else entirely, something she'd faced before, but never expected at this level of her career. The next few minutes would prove to be pivotal, not just for Dr. Thompson's journey to her patient, but for exposing a deeply troubling reality in private aviation that had gone unchecked for far too long. Finally boarding the aircraft, Dr. Thompson felt the weight of every step up those stairs. The familiar leather scent of the cabin usually brought comfort, a sign she was on her way to help another patient. Today, it felt different. The air inside was thick with unspoken tension. The lead flight attendant stood near the entrance, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. Her smile seemed plastered on, nothing like the warm greetings Dr. Thompson usually received as a regular passenger. "Your seat is—" "Let me check again," she said, flipping through papers she'd already checked twice before. Dr. Thompson knew exactly where her seat was, the same one she'd reserved countless times, by the window, 3rd row back. Perfect for reviewing patient files during flight. She'd chosen it specifically for the lighting. But she waited patiently, watching as the attendant made a show of double-checking what they both knew. Behind her, other passengers started boarding. The tech executive who'd been in the terminal settled into his seat across the aisle, his phone casually resting on his lap, still recording. An older couple took their seats up front, speaking in whispers and casting concerned glances backward. "There seems to be some confusion about your booking," the flight attendant announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Dr. Thompson felt her heart rate rise, but kept her voice steady. "I've shown you my confirmation 3 times now," she said calmly. "I'm a preferred member of your medical transport program. I have a critical patient waiting in Boston." The pilot emerged from the cockpit, his face set in what looked like practiced concern. "Ma'am, we need to verify some additional details about your reservation." His words were polite, but his tone suggested something else entirely. Dr. Thompson had heard this tone before. In elegant restaurants when being told her reserved table wasn't available, in high-end stores when being followed by security. She reached for her phone again, pulling up not just her booking confirmation, but her entire flight history with Elite Airways. 5 years of regular flights, perfect record, multiple commendations from their medical transport division. The pilot barely glanced at the screen. Other crew members huddled near the cockpit, whispering and pointing at papers they passed between themselves. One flight attendant was on the phone, speaking quietly but urgently into the receiver. The scene felt surreal, like a poorly rehearsed play where everyone knew their parts, but nobody wanted to speak their lines out loud. Dr. Thompson thought about her patient in Boston, imagining the family's anxiety growing with each passing minute. She promised to be there by evening. Her hands instinctively reached for her medical bag, feeling the familiar shape of her surgical planning documents inside. The tech executive shifted in his seat, his phone still capturing everything. More passengers were boarding now, the atmosphere growing increasingly uncomfortable as they witnessed the scene. Some avoided eye contact completely, while others watched with obvious concern. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Thompson stated firmly, her professional composure intact despite the growing absurdity of the situation. "I've flown with Elite Airways over 50 times in the past 5 years. Every credential you're questioning has been verified multiple times." The crew members exchanged glances, their discomfort visible but their positions unchanged. Through the cabin windows, Dr. Thompson could see ground staff gathering near the aircraft, some pointing up at the cabin. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. It hadn't been from the start. Time seemed to slow down in that cabin, each minute stretching longer than the last. The air conditioning hummed overhead, but the air felt stifling. What happened next would not only change the course of Dr. Thompson's day, but would spark a conversation that the private aviation industry couldn't ignore. The tech executive's fingers moved swiftly across his phone screen, making sure he captured every moment. He'd witnessed unfair treatment before, but never this blatant, never this calculated. His camera caught everything. The subtle eye rolls from the crew, the exaggerated sighs, the manufactured confusion over perfectly valid documents. For the record, he spoke clearly into his phone, "I'm watching an accomplished doctor being harassed for no apparent reason." A few nearby passengers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, suddenly aware their actions weren't going unnoticed. Dr. Thompson remained composed, though her hand trembled slightly as she checked her watch again. Another hour had passed. Another hour her patient in Boston would have to wait. She'd handled countless high-pressure situations in the operating room, but this was different. This wasn't about medical expertise or quick thinking. This was about something much more fundamental. The recording captured a hushed conversation between crew members near the cockpit. "We can't just," one whispered, their words barely audible. "But the supervisor said," another replied, glancing anxiously at the growing number of phones pointed their way. The truth was becoming harder to hide behind polite smiles and protocol excuses. A younger flight attendant approached Dr. Thompson, clutching a manual that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "It says here that medical transport passengers need additional verification," she stated, her voice wavering. The tech executive's camera zoomed in on the manual, its pages clearly showing no such requirement. Other passengers had begun to speak up. "This is ridiculous," called out an elderly woman from the back. "I've never seen anything like this," added a businessman who'd been quietly watching the scene unfold. Their voices added to the video's powerful narrative, a clear contrast to the crew's behavior. The pilot emerged again, this time with a phone in hand. "Corporate is asking about a situation on board," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. The tech executive adjusted his camera angle, making sure to capture the pilot's face as he tried to justify what was happening. Dr. Thompson pulled out her own phone, displaying her medical credentials one more time. "I have a patient waiting," she said, her voice steady but tired. "A human being who needs surgery. Every minute we waste here." The camera caught the sharp contrast between her professional patience and the crew's escalating hostility. The video would later show how the crew huddled together, whispering and pointing, trying to create a narrative that didn't exist. One flight attendant could be heard saying, "Maybe we should say she was being disruptive." The tech executive's microphone picked up every word, every attempted fabrication. Through the cabin windows, more ground staff had gathered, their faces a mix of concern and confusion. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The light caught Dr. Thompson's face as she stood there, highlighting both her dignity and her exhaustion. "I'm documenting everything," the tech executive announced calmly, as more passengers joined in with their own phones. "Every single moment." His words seemed to make the crew even more nervous, their actions becoming more frantic, less coordinated. The recording captured it all: the subtle looks, the manufactured delays, the desperate attempts to justify their actions. But most importantly, it captured the truth that nobody could deny: an accomplished medical professional being treated like an unwelcome intruder, simply because of how she looked. Little did the crew know that this video would soon reach millions, forcing not just their airline, but the entire industry to confront an uncomfortable reality they ignored for far too long. The cabin fell silent as two security officers climbed the aircraft stairs. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, making the moment feel even more surreal. Dr. Thompson stood perfectly still, her medical bag clutched close, watching as they approached with practiced authority. "This is absolutely unnecessary," spoke up the elderly woman from the back of the plane. Her voice quivered with anger. More passengers joined in, their voices rising in protest. The tech executive's phone kept recording, capturing every moment of this unfolding injustice. Dr. Thompson took a deep breath, the same way she did before every surgery. "I want everyone to know," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the cabin, "that I'm complying under protest. My patient in Boston needs me, and I can't afford to waste more time fighting this obvious discrimination." The security officers looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting to find a calm, professional doctor instead of the disruptive passenger they'd been told about. One of them glanced at his paperwork, then at the crew, confusion evident on his face. "She's done nothing wrong," called out a young woman near the window. "We've all been watching. This is shameful." Other passengers nodded in agreement, some standing up in protest. Phones were raised throughout the cabin, recording from every angle. The pilot stayed near the cockpit, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. The lead flight attendant busied herself with paperwork, pretending not to hear the passengers' protests. Their silence spoke volumes, captured forever in dozens of videos. Dr. Thompson gathered her belongings with deliberate calm. "I need names," she said firmly. "Everyone involved in this decision. My lawyer will be in touch." The tech executive zoomed in on the crew members' name tags, ensuring everything was documented. As she walked toward the exit, Dr. Thompson pulled out her phone one last time. "I'm calling Boston General," she announced. "They need to know why their patient's surgery will be delayed. I'm sure the hospital's legal team will be very interested in this situation." The evening air hit her face as she stepped onto the stairs. Below, more passengers from other flights had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Many had their phones out, recording the moment a respected doctor was being escorted off a plane she'd flown countless times before. "This isn't over," called out the tech executive, still recording. "The world will see this." His words seemed to hang in the air, making several crew members shift nervously. They knew, deep down, that this wasn't a moment they could hide or explain away. Ground staff watched in stunned silence as Dr. Thompson walked across the tarmac, her head held high, her medical bag still clutched in her hand. The security officers walked beside her, their earlier authority now seeming more like an embarrassed escort. In the terminal, other travelers stopped to watch. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking why the lady doctor was being made to leave. The mother had no answer, just a sad shake of her head and tears in her eyes. Dr. Thompson's heels clicked against the terminal floor, each step echoing with purpose. She'd spent years breaking barriers in medicine, saving countless lives, only to be reminded that some barriers still stood firm. But this time, thanks to dozens of witnesses and their cameras, this barrier wouldn't stay standing for long. As she reached the terminal exit, Dr. Thompson turned back for one final look at the aircraft. The sun had nearly set now, but the light of truth was just beginning to shine on a problem that could no longer be ignored. The tech executive's hands shook slightly as he uploaded the video. He'd barely stepped off the plane before hitting post on his social media accounts. "What I just witnessed," he wrote, "was one of the most blatant examples of discrimination I've ever seen. A respected doctor, trying to reach her patient, treated like this." Within minutes, the notifications started pouring in. 10 shares became 100. 100 became 1,000. Comments flooded in from around the world, each ping on his phone a reminder that people were watching, that they cared, that they were angry. Other passengers began sharing their videos too. Different angles, different moments, but all telling the same story. The elderly woman who'd spoken up posted her shaky footage with trembling hands in her car, tears in her eyes as she described what she'd witnessed. "I couldn't stay quiet," she said in her video. "Not this time." The young mother from the terminal shared her daughter's innocent question. Why did they make the doctor leave? The simplicity of a child's confusion cut through all the corporate excuses, making the incident's injustice even clearer. News outlets started calling within hours. The tech executive's phone wouldn't stop ringing. "Yes, I was there," he kept saying. "Yes, I saw everything. No, she did absolutely nothing wrong." Each interview spread the story further, wider, making it impossible to ignore. Hospital staff from Boston General joined the online conversation. "This doctor has saved countless lives," one nurse wrote. "She's flown this route dozens of times to help critical patients. What happened today is inexcusable." Medical professionals from around the country began sharing their own similar experiences. The airline's social media accounts were overwhelmed. Their standard corporate responses only fueled the fire. "We take these allegations seriously," they posted. The replies came fast and furious. "We all saw the video. There's nothing to investigate. It's all on camera. We were there. We saw everything." By evening, major news networks had picked up the story. The clips played on repeat. Dr. Thompson's dignified composure, the crew's manufactured excuses, the passengers' outrage. Each replay brought new waves of anger, new calls for accountability. Celebrities and public figures began sharing the video. "This stops now," wrote a famous athlete. "Not in 2024," posted an award-winning actress. Their millions of followers amplified the message, turning a single incident into a national conversation. Medical associations released statements of support. "Dr. Thompson represents the best of our profession," the National Medical Association declared. "Her treatment today reflects ongoing biases that must be addressed." Their words carried weight, forcing the aviation industry to pay attention. The videos kept spreading, crossing borders and time zones. People in London watched over breakfast what had happened in Atlanta the previous evening. Australian news covered it during their evening broadcast. The story wasn't just going viral, it was going global. Comment sections filled with similar stories. This happened to my sister. I saw something like this last month. When will this end? Each comment added to the growing realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first time it had been so thoroughly documented. Hashtags started trending. Hashtag Justice for De Thompson. Hashtag Elite Airway Shame. Hashtag West End with her. The airline's attempts to manage the situation only made things worse. Their corporate communications team was overwhelmed, their responses increasingly desperate as the story spiraled beyond their control. As night fell, the video's view count passed 10 million. But this wasn't just about views or viral content. It was about truth being exposed in real time, about justice being demanded by thousands of voices speaking as one. The world was watching, and they wouldn't look away until something changed. The CEO of Elite Airways sat in his office at 3 a.m., his tie loosened, coffee cups scattered across his desk. The videos played on repeat on his laptop, each angle showing the same undeniable truth. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. This wasn't just a PR crisis. This was a moment of truth for his entire company. "Get me everything," he told his assistant over the speakerphone. "Flight records, crew histories, internal communications. I want it all on my desk within the hour." His voice carried the weight of someone who knew exactly how serious this situation was. Down in HR, staff members worked through the night, pulling personnel files and reviewing past complaints. What they found made their hearts sink. There were patterns, subtle at first, but clear once you looked closely. Previous incidents had been quietly handled, passengers silenced with upgrades and apologies. The legal team huddled in their conference room, papers spread across the table, watching as social media numbers climbed higher. "We can't spin this," one lawyer said, rubbing his tired eyes. "The videos are too clear, too damning. We need to take real action." Internal emails began surfacing. Messages between crew members that made the CEO's blood run cold. Another one of those passengers, one had written, "You know the type." Each message dug the hole deeper, revealing a culture of bias that had gone unchecked for far too long. By sunrise, the decision was made. The CEO drafted a statement himself, deleting and rewriting each sentence multiple times. This couldn't be another corporate apology filled with empty promises. This had to be different. The board of directors convened an emergency video call. Some argued for damage control, for the usual corporate playbook. But as they watched the videos again, saw Dr. Thompson's dignity in the face of such treatment, they knew standard procedures wouldn't be enough. The entire crew was terminated, effective immediately, the CEO announced to his leadership team. The room fell silent. This kind of swift, decisive action was unprecedented. But then again, they'd never faced evidence this clear, this undeniable. The press release went out at 9 a.m. sharp. No corporate jargon, no hiding behind policies and procedures. "We failed," it began. "We failed Dr. Thompson, we failed our principals, and we failed as human beings. This ends today." The company's social media channels published the full investigation findings, every email, every complaint, every pattern of behavior that had led to this moment. Transparency wasn't just a buzzword anymore. It was their only path forward. HR began calling each terminated crew member. Some protested, threatened lawsuits. But the videos spoke for themselves. There was no defense, no explanation that could justify what had happened on that plane. By afternoon, the CEO was live on national news. He didn't sit behind a desk or stand at a podium. He sat in an armchair, tie removed, looking directly into the camera. "I could offer excuses," he said. "I could hide behind corporate policies. But I won't. What happened to Dr. Thompson was wrong, and we're taking immediate action." The company announced a complete overhaul of their training programs. Every employee, from pilots to ground staff, would undergo extensive bias awareness training. But more importantly, they were changing their hiring practices, their promotion criteria, their entire corporate culture. As evening approached, Dr. Thompson received a personal call from the CEO. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to explain away what had happened. Instead, he listened as she shared her story, her experiences, her perspective on what needed to change. Real change would take time, but at least now it had a chance to begin. 6 months had passed since that evening on the tarmac. Dr. Thompson stood at a podium in front of Elite Airways headquarters, addressing a crowd of journalists, aviation industry leaders, and corporate executives. The summer sun was bright, but not as bright as the hope in her eyes. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "But it does happen when we refuse to stay silent." Behind her stood a diverse group of newly hired pilots and crew members, all part of Elite Airways' reformed hiring initiative. The tech executive who'd recorded the original video sat in the front row. His viral post had done more than expose one incident. It had cracked open a door that had been shut for too long. Other passengers from that day were there too, including the elderly woman who'd spoken up. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were part of a movement. Inside the building, training sessions were underway. Not the old-style corporate videos about policies and procedures, but real conversations led by diversity experts and people who'd experienced discrimination firsthand. Employees shared stories, asked uncomfortable questions, and learned to recognize their own biases. Other airlines had taken notice. One by one, they'd launched their own investigations, their own reforms. The industry that had once buried these incidents under paperwork and payoffs was finally facing its problems head-on. Competition was no longer just about luxury seats and flight routes. It was about creating a truly inclusive environment. Dr. Thompson's patient from that day was in the audience too. She'd eventually made it to Boston for his surgery, albeit on a different airline. He'd recovered fully and had become an unexpected advocate for change, sharing his story about how discrimination in aviation could have cost him his life. The company's internal culture had transformed. The new CEO had kept his word. Every policy was reviewed, every complaint investigated. But more importantly, employees felt empowered to speak up when they saw something wrong. The fear of retaliation had been replaced by a commitment to doing what was right. Statistics told part of the story. Complaints of discrimination had dropped by 85%. But the real change was in the small moments. The warm welcomes at check-in, the respectful treatment in first class, the simple dignity of being seen as a person rather than a problem. Young medical students reached out to Dr. Thompson regularly, sharing how her story had given them courage. "If you stood up to this," one wrote, "I can stand up too." Each message reminded her that sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most important changes. The elderly woman who'd spoken up that day had started a passenger advocacy group. "We can't just watch anymore," she told the crowd. "We have to act." Her organization had already helped dozens of travelers document and report discrimination, ensuring no incident went unnoticed. Elite Airways had become a case study in corporate transformation. Business schools taught about their response, not as a PR strategy, but as an example of genuine reform. The stock price had initially dropped, but then rose higher than ever as customers rewarded their commitment to change. Dr. Thompson concluded her speech by announcing a new industry-wide initiative. A coalition of airlines, medical professionals, and civil rights organizations working together to ensure equal treatment in private aviation. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, but she raised her hand for quiet. "This isn't about applause," she said softly. "This is about making sure that the next doctor rushing to save a life, the next professional trying to do their job, never has to face what I faced. This is about changing not just policies, but hearts and minds." As the sun set behind the corporate headquarters, casting long shadows across the crowd, there was a sense that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Real change was happening, one flight, one person, one moment of courage at a time.